Hi there. It's June 27th, and we continue our progress through the Acts of the Apostles, Luke's sequel to his Good News. And we are in chapter 18, and we're reading from verses 1 to 22. Paul has left Athens, where he hasn't seen that much fruit for the gospel, and he now comes to the city of Corinth. Corinth was a very well-known city in the empire, had a really strategic place in Greece. It was a Roman colony. It had been refounded by Julius Caesar and was near the northern end of an isthmus. An isthmus is a small piece of land between two seas, and the northern end of the isthmus is where Corinth was. And this isthmus was actually used by the Greeks and Romans to build a great carriageway or a wagon way that carried ships from the northern end of the isthmus to the south, so that it avoided a great long voyage around Achaia. And this was known as the Olkos, a stone carriageway, a stone shipway, and this led to the great prosperity of Corinth. But not only was Corinth a prosperous city, it was also a very morally disturbed city, in that it had a great temple of Aphrodite on top of the Acrocorinthos, the great hill, 2,000-foot high hill that overlooked the city, and the priestesses of Aphrodite and the prostitutes that were linked to it were known for their debauchery. And so this gave Corinth a certain flavour, a maritime city, a city filled with immorality. But here Paul comes. Now in Corinth he teams up with a Jewish couple by the name of Aquila and Priscilla, and they have been expelled from Rome. They've come from Rome and they're living there, and they're tent makers, and that just happens to be the same profession that Paul has learned to maintain himself, and so they work together. For many Sabbaths, Paul goes to the synagogue in Corinth and he seeks to convince the Jews and Gentiles there of the fact that Jesus is Messiah, but he kind of gets into trouble with them and he is ejected, even though he's led the leader of the synagogue to Jesus. And so when he's expelled, it says he shakes out his clothes, he kind of puts the dust off his feet, as it were, but he sets up in the school, in a school opposite the synagogue, and so he becomes a constant thorn in the side of the Jewish community in Corinth. While he's there, Timothy and Silas also return, or they come and connect with him, and this means Paul feels himself even more ready to give himself to sharing the good news. One night we read that Paul has a dream. The Lord comes to him and encourages Paul to speak up and to speak out and to not be afraid of opposition, because no one is going to harm him. And perhaps it's good that he's heard this from the Lord specifically, because the next section in chapter 18 here is of the boiling over of the anger of the Jews, the Jewish community, against Paul's message. And they drag him before Gallio, who is the proconsul of Achaia, that region of Greece. And Gallio is well attested in history, and also was the brother of a famous Roman figure, Seneca. He is as I say, the proconsul of this area, and they bring Paul before him, accusing Paul of teaching worship of God which is not in accordance with the law. And Paul is just about to make his defense when Gallio actually stops them and says, wait a minute, this is not about Roman laws, and this is not about my jurisdiction. I'm stopping this right here, because if you've got arguments about religious words and meanings, you have to deal with it yourself. And so he dismisses the case, which leads to the beating of the leader of the synagogue, which happens right in front of Gallio's eyes, and he doesn't seem to do anything about it, it suggests that he's quite callous, cold and hard. But interestingly, he's not like Pilate. Pilate got involved and interfered, in a sense, in the dispute with Jesus, but here Gallio refuses to get involved in this dispute. So Paul continues, having been in Corinth for 18 months, he now continues a little while longer, but then he goes with Priscilla and Aquila, leaving Corinth. He goes to the other end of the isthmus on the Aegean Sea to a place called Cenchreae. Cenchreae is actually where there was a small church there, or a church there, led by a lady called Phoebe. And at Cenchreae, for some reason, we're not exactly sure why, but Paul takes a vow, maybe a Nazarite vow, not to drink, and he has his hair shaved so that the hair that grows will then be a sign of his devotion to God. And it may be that this vow is about going to Jerusalem, that he's setting himself to go to Jerusalem, that here he's acknowledging the Jewish part of him, the Pharisee part of him, and therefore he is seeking to establish that he is still a Jew. He's not abandoned his Jewish credentials. So he takes this vow, and then he sails across to Ephesus on the western end of Turkey, and there he leaves Aquila and Priscilla. Even though they would like him to stay and to be with them, Paul says, no, I have to go back. I'm going to Jerusalem. And at the end of this reading, he travels back to Caesarea Maritima, the port where he lands. And then he goes to Jerusalem, and maybe he fulfills the vow that he's taken at Cenchreae. We're not given much detail about it, but then he returns to Syrian Antioch, to his home base. Corinth became a very successful and flourishing church, and that's testified to by the fact that later Paul writes 2 letters to them, and they're a church very given over to the ways of the Holy Spirit. But they're also a problematic church, and the church with a lot of disputes going on, as we'll see when we come to read the book of Corinthians. We can be sure that the gospel of Jesus is not limited, that it's here speaking to both Jews and Gentiles, and seeing many turning to faith, despite the opposition that comes against it. We need to continue to be given to seeing God's gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ, continuing to grow and to flourish, and giving ourselves to that work. Have a very good June the 27th.